Thank you for joining me on the news. The headline says thousands of troops sent by US and South Korea to practice amphibious assault. French Parliament recognizes genocide Ukraine's Soviet-era famine. United Nations to consider role of ICJ in climate change. Meanwhile, Beijing promises reaction if Taiwanese leader meets US speaker, and Russia begins exercises with US intercontinental ballistic missiles. Stay with me for these more stories. North Korea has been building up a ballistic missile arsenal on the stated idea that it needs to prevent an attack on it by United States and South Korean troops. Washington and Seoul have been showing their firepower through a rising of number of drills, all of which the two allies say are defensive in nature. Wednesday morning, however, they used thousands of troops and high-end weaponry to practice a beach assault, a maneuver offensive in its nature and designed to take territory, not protect it. Sang Yong, the commander of the 2,200 U.S. Marines involved in drills in Pohang in the southern coast of South Korea, defends what's taking place as not provocative. Colonel Samuel Meyer, commander of the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit, said, "I don't think we are doing anything different or odd." The maneuver put the integrated firepower of U.S. and South Korean forces on full display. Shoals Marines came ashore first in waves of 23-ton amphibious assault vehicles, their trucks leaving foot-deep gashes in the Pohang sands. As the South Korean Marines moved to trees lined behind the beach, gigantic U.S. Navy hovercraft known as LCACs followed, disgorging 8-wheeled amphibious vehicles with nicknames like Rooster, Cerberus, and Ghost stenciled on their sides. In the skies above were attack helicopters, Osprey transports, and F-35B stealth fighters, 10 of which were embarked aboard the beach assault ship USS McKean Island, waiting 30 miles offshore. This is the 70th anniversary of this exercise. It's not new, Mayor said, discharging assertions by Pyongyang that Washington and Seoul are being provocative and forcing North Korea to build up its nuclear program as deterrence. The U.S. Marine Colonel added that this is routine. We're just getting back to the routine based on what we saw and experienced. On Russia-Ukraine war, the French Member of Parliament has recognized as genocide the 1930 starvation of millions in Ukraine under Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, a step hailed by President Volodymyr Zelensky. In a resolution adopted by 168 votes to 2, the lawmakers called on the French government to do the same, as the present Russian war in Ukraine brings back memories of the atrocities inflicted out on Ukraine in the 1930s by Stalin. On Tuesday, the text adopted in Paris recognized the genocidal nature of the enforced and deliberate famine by the Soviet authorities against the Ukrainian population in 1932 and 1933. The 1932-33 Holodomor, the Ukrainian word for death by starvation, is regarded by Kyiv as an intentional act of genocide by Stalin's regime with the aim of wiping out the peasantry. Stalin's campaign of forced collectivization seized grain and other foodstuffs and left millions to starve. Zelensky said yesterday that he appreciated the historic decision in a tweet thanking the French members of parliament. Kyiv has urged the international community to declare the starvation in Ukraine as genocide. Today we have a decision of the French parliament which recognized the Holodomor as genocide of the Ukrainian people, Zelensky said later. Moscow discards Kyiv account of the period, placing the starvation in Ukraine in the broader context of famines that devastated regions of Central Asia and Russia. Moscow continuing war, the aiming of Ukrainian grain storage facilities is blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea exports have raised accusations that Russia is using food as an armament of war once again. The United Nations General Assembly is set to vote on a resolution proposed by the South Pacific island nation of Vanuatu that will ask the International Court of Justice, ICJ, for its opinion on what lawful responsibilities nations are under to guard climate systems and people affected by climate change. The court's opinion will be required on what the legal penalties should be for states that by their acts and omissions cause such damage to the climate that affects others, especially small island nations and their citizens who are among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The co-sponsored resolution by 120 countries at the United Nations, including Australia, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and many European Union states, could be adopted on Wednesday by a consensus or passed with a simple majority, which would need at most 97 countries voting yes. Or it might not be adopted at all, but if the resolution passes as expected, the United Nations General Assembly will then ask the ICJ to explain the legal obligations that states are under and the consequences if they fail to protect present and future generations from climate change. The Pacific nation of Vanuatu, an archipelago of approximately 80 islands spread across 1,300 kilometers, which was rocked by 2 Category 4 cyclones within 3 days earlier this month, is leading the initiative. Vanuatu's Minister of Climate Change Adaptation, Ralph Regenavanu, last week at a press conference said, "For us, this was an unprecedented weather event consistent with what science tells us is a result of climate change. We estimate the cost of this disaster will exceed half of our annual GDP, gross domestic product," he said. "We are well and truly in the midst of a continuing climate emergency." Addressing the possible outcomes of the resolution is adopted and the ICJ gives an advisory opinion, Regenavanu spoke of such ideas as a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty or adding a crime of ecocide to international law. The country's campaign to include the ICJ in climate justice follows after the newest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, report delivered a dire warning that human-caused climate change is already impacting several weather and climate extremes in every region across the world. The global surface temperature has added by 1.1 degrees Celsius in the past century and is likely to continue growing. The latest IPCC report details show if the trend goes on, the world surface temperature will likely surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius in this century and make it harder to limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius. On politics, China has vowed to resolutely fight back if Kevin McCarthy, U.S. House of Representatives Speaker, meets Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen during her planned journey through the United States. On Wednesday, the warning came as Tsai was set to leave for a trip to Guatemala and Belize, which will see her transit through New York and California in the United States. While not formally confirmed, she is anticipated to meet McCarthy while in California at the end of her 10-day trip. Beijing, which claims democratically rule Taiwan as its own territory, has continually cautioned U.S. officials not to meet Tsai, seeing it as backing for the island's yearning to be seen as an independent country. Last August, China staged war games around Taiwan when the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taipei. Taiwan's troops have said they are keeping watch for any Chinese moves when its Tsai is abroad. Spokesperson of China's Taiwan Affairs Office Zhu Fenglian said, according to reports in Beijing, that Tsai's transits of the U.S. were not just her waiting at the airport or hotel, but for her to meet U.S. officials and legislators. If she has contact with U.S. House Speaker McCarthy, it will be another provocation that seriously violates the One China principle, harms China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and destroys peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, she said. We firmly oppose this and will definitely take measures to resolutely fight back, Zhu added, without giving details. Such transit by Taiwanese presidents are routine and that China should not use Tsai's journey to take any aggressive steps against Taiwan, the U.S. says. Taiwanese leaders usually pass through the U.S. while visiting diplomatic allies in Latin America, the Caribbean and the Pacific, which, although not official visits, are often used by both sides for high-profile meetings. Russia has begun drills with the Yars intercontinental ballistic missile ICBM system and several thousand soldiers in what is expected to be seen as another attempt by Moscow to show off its nuclear strength. Over 3,000 military personnel and around 300 pieces of equipment in total are involved in the exercises, Russia's defense ministry said in a statement on Wednesday. Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has meant to make the Yars missile system, which replaced the Topol system, part of Russia's invisible weapons and the backbone of the ground-based component of its nuclear arsenal. The Yas mobile systems will conduct exercises in 3 Russian regions during the maneuvers, the ministry said, without mentioning the regions. The ministry added that strategic missile men will carry out a set of measures to camouflage and counter modern aerial reconnaissance means in cooperation with formations and units of the Central Military District and Aerospace Forces. There are insufficient confirmed strategic and technical characteristics of the Yas mobile ICBM, which reportedly have a capability range of 12,000 kilometers, 7,500 miles, and can carry numerous nuclear warheads, according to military bloggers. Since launching its invasion of Ukraine in February last year, Russia has conducted many military drills on its own or with other countries such as China or South Africa. It has also added military training with Belarus, which borders both Russia and Ukraine, conducting a sequence of inclusive maneuvers over the past year. And there are more stories. US ceases sharing new data under faltering START deal. The United States has told Russia it will stop swapping detailed data on its nuclear weapons stockpiles, calling the step a reaction to Russia's suspension of involvement in the New START nuclear arms treaty, the White House said. While Russian President Vladimir Putin has not officially withdrawn from the treaty, his halting from sharing it announced in February has threatened the last pillar of U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control. The U.S. and Russia hold closely 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, sufficient to destroy the planet numerous times over. The New START Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty START restricts the number of strategic nuclear warheads countries deploy. On Tuesday, John Kirby, the U.S. National Security Council spokesperson, said, according to reports, that Russia has not been in full compliance and refused to share data which we agreed in New START to share manually. Since they have refused to be in compliance, we have decided likewise not to share the data, he said, making it clear that the data will only be shared again when Russia was also prepared to do so. The US and Russia are obligated to exchange comprehensive databases twice a year. We offered to continue reciprocal implementation of this obligation. Unfortunately, Russia informed the US that it would not engage in this data exchange due to its purported suspension of this treaty, Vandad Patel, deputy spokesperson for the US State Department, said at a press conference. Under the terms of the New START, signed in 2010 and will expire in 2026, Moscow and Washington may deploy no more than 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads and 700 land and submarine-based missiles and bombers to deliver them. Again, in politics, over judicial reform, U.S. leader Netanyahu battled words. Joe Biden, United States President, has told Israel it cannot continue pushing ahead with extremely controversial judicial changes presently on hold that have triggered months of protest comments that had led Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to say he does not make decisions based on pressure from abroad. On Tuesday, Biden's comments came as Netanyahu was being accused by opponents of riding roughshod over Israeli democracy in an attempt to reinforce his own power, leading to paralyzing protests and strikes across Israel. Biden urged Netanyahu's administration to drop the controversial judicial law, speaking later in Washington, D.C. Netanyahu, who immediately issued a statement in response to Biden, the report said his administration was determined to make reforms via broad consensus, saying the Israel-US alliance is unbreakable and always overcomes the occasional disagreements between us. Israel's President Isaac Herzog on Monday called on Netanyahu and the ruling coalition to stop its judicial reforms for the sake of the unity of the people of Israel, for the sake of responsibility. The appeal by the head of state, who usually does not participate in politics, underlines the alarm that the proposals have caused and comes after a dramatic night of protests across Israel on Sunday following the dismissing of the country's defense minister. Several demonstrators took to the streets in cities across Israel in a spontaneous outburst of exasperation after Netanyahu fired his defense minister for challenging his judicial overhaul plan. Sacked Defense Minister Yoav Gallant had been the first senior member of the ruling Likud party to speak out against the reforms, saying the deep divisions were threatening to weaken Israel's military. And in African scenes, United Nations voices fears as Africa's Sahel region becomes new terrorism targets. On Tuesday, Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary General, said he's deeply worried by the advances terrorist groups are making in the Sahel and elsewhere. Guterres read from prepared remarks delivered at a Security Council meeting on counter-terrorism called for Mozambique this month's council precedent. No age, no culture, no religion, no nationality, and no region is immune, but the situation in Africa is especially concerning. Despair, poverty, hunger, lack of basic services, unemployment, and unconstitutional changes in government continue to lay fertile ground for the creeping expansion of terrorist groups to infect new parts of the continent. I am deeply concerned by the gains terrorist groups are making in the Sahel and elsewhere, he said. Filipe Jacinto Nyusi, Mozambique's leader who led the meeting, said the situation in Africa is particularly critical as terrorist groups depend on illicit activities to funding and recruitment. United Kingdom Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, James Kariuki, proposed the use of United Nations sanctions as a solution. As we work to cut off the funding of terrorism, we encourage greater use of United Nations sanctions regimes on the continent of Africa, whilst ensuring continued delivery of humanitarian assistance to states responding to crisis. We deeply value our cooperation with regional partners on the Al-Shabaab sanctions regime. We have used this to continue tightening the norms on Al-Shabaab, including through sponsoring the designation of individuals associated with our group, Kiruki added. Let's go on a short break, and when I come back, I'll bring you stories from Nigeria. Welcome back on Politics in Nigeria. PDP crisis. Party appoints acting chair as Ayu heads to court. Crisis in the People's Democratic Party, PDP, has deepened as it takes a new dimension, with the Benue State High Court in Makurdi, George W. Ikpochi, on Monday issuing an interim injunction restraining Mr. Ayu from parading himself as the national chair of the PDP. The judge issued the order following an ex parte application by a member of the party in Benue State, Tahide Utan. Being an ex parte hearing, both Mr. Ayu and the PDP joined as respondents to the application, were neither present nor represented by their lawyers in court. The court order came barely 24 hours after the executive committee of the party at Mr. Ayu's ward, Igorov ward in Benue State, suspended him. The national chairman of the People's Democratic Party, Senator Iocha Ayu, who stepped aside from his position on Tuesday, is certified his suspension by a Benue State High Court, Makurdi, on Monday. This was revealed by Ayu's Special Assistant on Communications, Simon Imobo Swam, shortly after the party announced the appointment of the Deputy National Chairman North, Umar Damagum, as the acting national chairman. He said Ayu would challenge the suspension in order in court. The case has been adjourned till April 17th for a hearing. Monday's court order brings back the memory of how Mr. Ayu's predecessor, Uche Secondus, was forced out of the PDP after he was suspended by the ward and restrained by a court order. The chairman has been hanging on to his job in spite of opposition from high-profile members of the party since May last year. 5 of the party's governors, namely Nyesom Wike of Rivers, Ifeanyi Ugwuanyi of Enugu, Seyi Makinde of Oyo, Ekeze Ikpeazu of Abia, and Mr. Autumn, demanded his removal as a condition to back Atiku Abubakar, the presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party, PDP. President Muhammadu Buhari says oil discovery in Nasarawa will lead to prosperity, energy security. President Muhammadu Buhari on Tuesday declared that the discovery and drilling of oil in Nasarawa State will lead to greater prosperity for Nigerians, as well as enhance overall energy security for the country. In his virtual message to the official spotting of the Ebenyi A well located in the Middle Benue Tro in Obi local government area of Nasarawa State, the president said the surrounding communities will particularly benefit from the value created by the exploration and eventual production activities. The president, in a statement by his media aide Femi Adesina, directed NNPC Limited and its partners to take due care of the environmental consequences of the oil exploration activities and to mitigate the negative effects. He thanked the government and people of Nasarawa State, the host community, for their unfettered support and collaboration towards the success of this exploration campaign. The president recalled that the official commencement of drilling activities in the Middle Benue Tro is in line with ongoing campaigns for the the exploration of crude oil and gas in the nation's frontier basins. He listed the Chad Basin, Dahomey Basin, Anambra Platform, the Calabar Embankment, Sokoto Basin, Bidda Basin, Benue Trough, as well as the ultra-deep water Niger Delta as areas where NNPC is extending its crude oil exploration. And finally, on the news, Naira crisis, NLC shifts industrial action, gives 2 weeks ultimatum. The Nigeria Labour Congress, NLC, has extended its scheduled strike against the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, over cash scarcity by 2 weeks. Last week, the Labour Congress had issued a 7-day ultimatum to the federal government to mandate the CBN and commercial banks to end the cash crunch, threatening a nationwide protest and the picketing of the Apex Bank and its branches across the country from Wednesday, March 29th. NLC President Joe Ajero, speaking at a press conference in conjunction with the Trade Union Congress TUC in Abuja on Tuesday, said they had decided to give the CBN 2 more weeks to monitor the level of their compliance with the demand. Chris Ngige, Minister of Labour and Employment, who spoke at the weekly ministerial briefing organized by the Presidential Communication Team at the State House Abuja on Tuesday, said the threat of protest by the NLC against the Central Bank of Nigeria has been halted. To refresh our memories, thousands of troops sent by US and South Korea to practice amphibious assault. French Parliament recognized as genocide Ukraine Soviet-era famine. United Nations to consider role of ICJ in climate change. While Beijing promises reaction if Taiwanese leader meets US speaker, and Russia begins exercises with Yas intercontinental ballistic missiles. Thanks for staying with me. I am Lois Reiki.